Long before cities rose into the sky, before nations were formed, and before history was written in books, there was a world that no longer exists, a world remembered only through the ancient words of the Book of Genesis. In those early generations, humanity had already begun to spread across the earth. The descendants of Adam and Eve had multiplied, forming families, communities, and the first signs of civilization. From the outside, it may have looked like progress. People lived, worked, built, and expanded across the land. Life moved forward, generation after generation, as the world slowly filled with human presence. But beneath that surface, something far more troubling was unfolding, something that would change everything. The Bible describes this period in a way that is both simple and deeply unsettling. It does not speak first of achievements or advancements, but of the condition of the human heart. Over time, humanity had begun to drift. The harmony that once existed in the Garden of Eden had faded into memory, replaced by a world shaped by different desires. Thoughts that were once aligned with goodness had turned inward. Intentions that once reflected trust had become consumed by selfishness. The moral foundation of humanity, which had been fragile since the moment of disobedience in the garden, was now collapsing on a much larger scale. This was not a world where wrongdoing happened occasionally. It was a world where it had become normal. Violence spread across the land, not as isolated events, but as a pattern woven into daily life. Power began to replace justice. Strength began to outweigh compassion. Trust between people weakened, and relationships were no longer defined by unity, but by conflict and self-interest. The further humanity moved from its beginning, the more it seemed to forget what it had once been created for. The Book of Genesis describes this condition with a striking clarity, saying that every inclination of the human heart was only evil all the time. It is a statement that is difficult to fully grasp, because it suggests not just widespread corruption, but a complete transformation of human nature at that moment in history. Imagine a world where every decision is driven by selfish desire, where every intention leans toward harm, and where no internal resistance remains against wrongdoing. Such a world would not simply be flawed, it would be broken at its core. And yet, this was the direction humanity had taken. As the generations continued to grow, so did the distance between the world as it was and the world as it had once been. The memory of Eden, the place where humanity had lived in harmony with God, became increasingly distant. Fewer people remembered it, and even fewer seemed to care. The idea of walking with God, once central to human existence, was fading into obscurity. In its place, something else was rising, a world defined by human will, human ambition, and human control, regardless of the consequences. Then, in the midst of this growing darkness, the narrative reveals something unexpected. It shifts away from describing humanity and turns toward God. And what it reveals is not simply judgment, but emotion. The text tells us that God saw what humanity had become, and he was grieved. This is not the language of distant observation. It is not the reaction of a creator who is disconnected from his creation. It is the response of one who sees something good become something broken. The world that had once been declared very good had become unrecognizable. not because it had been created that way, but because it had changed over time through the choices of those who lived within it. The grief described here carries a profound weight. It suggests that the condition of humanity was not just a moral issue, but a relational one. The connection between God and humanity, the relationship that had defined life in the Garden of Eden, had been deeply damaged. What remained was a world filled with life, but lacking the harmony it was meant to reflect. And in that moment, as the narrative reaches this turning point, a decision begins to form. It is not announced immediately. There is no sudden declaration. Instead, there is a pause in the story, a moment where the weight of what has happened settles into place. Humanity has filled the earth, but in doing so, it has also filled it with corruption. The world continues to exist, but it no longer reflects its original purpose. Something must change, and as the story moves forward, it becomes clear that the next chapter will not be about gradual correction or slow transformation. It will be about something far more dramatic. Because in a world that had completely lost its way, the solution would not come from within humanity itself. It would come from outside it. And that is where the story of Noah begins. There are moments in history that feel irreversible, moments when a path has been chosen for so long that turning back no longer seems possible. The world described in the book of Genesis had reached such a point. Generation after generation had continued in the same direction, moving further away from the harmony that once defined human existence. What had begun as a gradual drift had become a complete transformation. The corruption of humanity was no longer hidden or occasional. It had become the defining characteristic of the world itself. And so, the narrative shifts again, this time toward a decision that is as profound as it is unsettling. God looked upon the earth, and what he saw was not simply imperfection, but total corruption. The violence that filled the world was not limited to isolated acts. It had spread into every corner of human life. The earth itself is described as being filled with it, as if the very fabric of existence had been saturated with human wrongdoing. This was not a temporary crisis. It was a condition that had taken root so deeply that it could not be undone by small changes or individual acts of goodness. The story makes something very clear. This was not the world as it was meant to be, and in that realization, a decision began to take form, a decision that would redefine everything that followed. According to the book of Genesis, God declared that he would bring an end to all life on the earth. It is a statement that carries an almost unimaginable weight. Not just people, but animals, creatures, and everything that breathed would be swept away. The scale of this decision is difficult to comprehend, because it is not a localized judgment or a limited event. It is global, total, absolute. This was not about correcting a single generation. It was about resetting the entire world. And yet, even in this moment of judgment, there is something that prevents the story from becoming one of complete destruction. There is a detail, quiet, almost easy to overlook, that changes the entire direction of the narrative. In the midst of a world consumed by corruption, one man is described differently. His name was Noah. The text does not introduce him with dramatic background or long explanation. Instead, it offers a simple but powerful description. Noah was righteous among the people of his time, and he walked with God. In a world where every inclination of the human heart had turned toward evil, this description sets him apart in a profound way. It does not mean he lived in a different world. He saw the same violence, the same corruption, the same collapse of moral order that everyone else did. But somehow, he did not become part of it. This is what makes the moment so significant, because as the decision to bring judgment upon the earth is revealed, it becomes clear that it will not apply equally to all. There will be an exception not because the world deserves it, but because one man has remained faithful within it, and through that one man, something new will begin. The decision to end the world as it existed is not reversed. The corruption is too deep, too widespread, too ingrained to simply fade away. But the existence of Noah introduces another possibility, that even in the midst of complete failure, there can still be a continuation, not of the same broken system, but of something renewed. This is where the story begins to move into directions at once. On one side, there is judgment, a world that will come to an end. On the other, there is preservation, the beginning of something that will survive beyond that end. And at the center of both is Noah. What follows is not just a warning, but an instruction, not just an ending, but a preparation. Because if the world is about to be reset, then there must be a way for life to continue beyond it. And that is where the next part of the story begins, when Noah is given a task that no one before him had ever imagined, a task that would require not only action, but faith in something the world had never seen. A flood, a destruction that would come not gradually, but suddenly, not partially, but completely, and a vessel that would carry life through it. But at this moment in the story, none of that has happened yet. The skies are still clear, the ground is still dry. The world continues as it always has, unaware of what is coming. Only one man knows, and what he does next will determine the future of humanity. In a world that had almost completely lost its way, the story narrows its focus to a single life, a single name that stands in quiet contrast to everything around it. The book of Genesis, it does not spend time building a dramatic introduction or recounting long details about his past. Instead, it presents him with a simplicity that feels almost intentional, as if the weight of who he is does not come from what he has done publicly, but from something deeper and less visible. His name was Noah, and in the middle of a corrupted world, he is described in a way no one else is. He was righteous, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. That description alone sets him apart, not as someone removed from the world, but as someone who lived within it without becoming defined by it. He saw the same violence, the same moral collapse, the same loss of direction that had spread across humanity. Yet something about him remained different. He did not follow the pattern that had become normal. He did not allow the condition of the world to reshape the condition of his heart. In a time when people no longer seemed to remember what it meant to live in alignment with God, Noah still did. And that quiet distinction, almost unnoticed by the world around him, would soon become the most important detail in the entire story. We are not told how Noah came to live this way. The text does not explain the moments that shaped his character or the choices that led him to walk a different path. There are no recorded conversations, no scenes of struggle or transformation. Instead, we are given the result: a man whose life stood in contrast to his generation. It is as if the story assumes that what matters most is not the process, but the outcome, the fact that in a world that had turned away, one person had not. And then, without warning, the silence surrounding Noah's life is broken by something extraordinary. God speaks to him. There is no indication that this had happened before in the same way. No explanation of how Noah understood or recognized the voice. But the message he receives is clear, direct, and unlike anything that had ever been given to a human being before. God reveals what is about to happen to the world. The corruption, the violence, the complete moral collapse of humanity have reached a point where they can no longer continue. The earth will be judged. Everything that breathes will be swept away. For Noah, this is not a distant idea or a future possibility. It is a reality that is about to unfold, and yet, within that message of destruction, there is also a commander task that feels almost impossible in its scale and its meaning. He is told to build an ark. The word itself suggests something vast, something unlike anything that had ever existed before. This was not a simple boat, not a vessel designed for a river or a sea journey. It was something entirely new, something that would need to survive an event the world had never experienced. A structure large enough to carry life through the destruction of everything else. A place of preservation in the middle of total loss. But the instruction raises a question that would have been impossible to ignore. How do you build a vessel for a flood when no such flood has ever happened? There is no indication in the text that humanity had ever seen rain on this scale, or waters rising to cover the earth. The world, as Noah knew it, followed patterns that seemed stable and predictable. Seasons came and went. Life continued. Nothing in his experience would have prepared him for what he was being told. And yet, he is asked to act as if it were certain. This is where the story shifts from description to decision. Because Noah is not just being informed about the future. He is being asked to respond to it, to take action based on something that has not yet happened, something that cannot be proven, something that no one else around him would understand or believe. To build the ark would not only require time and effort, it would require trust. Trust that the warning was real. Trust that the instructions were necessary. Trust that what could not yet be seen would one day become reality. And perhaps most difficult of all, it would require Noah to live differently from everyone else. Not just in belief, but in visible, undeniable action. As the rest of the world continued its routines, unaware or unwilling to see what was coming, Noah would begin building something that made no sense in their eyes. A structure that stood as a silent declaration that the world they trusted was not as secure as it seemed. The story does not record hesitation. It does not describe doubt or argument. Instead, it moves forward with a quiet certainty, stating simply that Noah did everything as he was commanded. And in that response, something remarkable is revealed. In a world defined by disobedience, one man chose obedience. In a world driven by corruption, one man chose faithfulness. In a world that no longer listened, one man heard and acted. That choice, made in what must have been an ordinary moment, would shape everything that followed. Because the survival of humanity, the continuation of life, and the beginning of a new world would all depend on what Noah was about to do next. And so, the man who had lived quietly, almost unnoticed in a broken world, steps into a role unlike any other. Not as a ruler, not as a warrior, but as a builder, someone tasked with creating the only refuge that would exist when the world, as it was known, came to an end. What begins next is not a sudden event, but a process, slow, visible, and impossible to hide. The construction of the ark, and with it, the unfolding of a story that would change the course of human history forever. What Noah was asked to do was not something that could be completed in a moment, or even in a single season. It was a task that would unfold over years, perhaps decades, requiring patience, endurance, and a level of commitment that would be tested every single day. The instructions he had received, recorded in the book of Genesis, were precise and deliberate. He was not simply told to build a vessel. He was given dimensions, structure, and design. The ark was to be massive, far larger than anything that would have been considered normal or necessary in his time. It would stretch hundreds of feet in length, rise in multiple levels, and be constructed in a way that could withstand forces the world had never seen before. This was not a symbolic act. It was physical, demanding, and unmistakably real. Each piece of wood had to be gathered. Each section had to be measured and assembled. Each level had to be carefully built. Day after day, Noah would have worked, shaping something that had no reference point in the world around him. There were no existing structures to copy, no examples to follow, no confirmation that what he was building would ever be needed. And yet, the work continued. What makes this part of the story so striking is not just the scale of the ark, but the environment in which it was built. The world had not changed yet. There were no signs of the coming flood. The skies remained as they always had. The ground was stable. Life continued in its familiar patterns. To anyone watching, nothing about the world suggested that it was on the verge of destruction. And yet, in the middle of that unchanged world, there stood a growing structure that silently declared the opposite. It is impossible to imagine that Noah's work went unnoticed. A construction of that size would have drawn attention. People would have seen it from a distance. As it grew larger, curiosity would have turned into questions, and questions may have turned into doubt, or even ridicule. Why would anyone build such a thing? What purpose could it possibly serve? The idea of a flood large enough to cover the earth would have sounded beyond reason, beyond experience, beyond belief. And so, while Noah continued to build, the world around him likely continued to dismiss. This is where the weight of his task becomes even clearer. He was not only building an ark, he was building something that separated him from everyone else. With every beam placed and every level completed, the difference between him and the rest of humanity became more visible. His actions were a reflection of something no one else seemed to accept, that the world as it was would not remain as it was. And still, there is no record of him stopping. The text does not describe moments of hesitation. It does not tell us that he paused or questioned or turned away from the task. Instead, it emphasizes something far more powerful in its simplicity. He did everything as he was commanded. That quiet statement carries within it years of effort, years of consistency, years of choosing to continue even when nothing around him confirmed that he was right. As the ark took shape, it must have become impossible to ignore. What began as an idea had turned into a structure. What once may have seemed like an unusual project had become a towering reality. It stood as a physical reminder that something was coming, even if no one believed it. And then, as the construction reached its completion, the story begins to move toward its next and most dramatic moment. Because building the ark was only the beginning. Once it was finished, it would need to be filled. God instructed Noah not only to prepare the vessel, but to bring into it representatives of life itself, animals of every kind, creatures of the earth, birds of the air pairs that would enter the ark and be preserved through what was about to happen. This instruction adds another layer to the story, one that moves beyond construction and into something far more extraordinary. The ark was not just a place of survival for Noah and his family. It was a vessel of continuity for the entire living world. And as these preparations unfolded, the sense of anticipation would have grown. Everything was being set in place. The structure was complete. The provisions were gathered. The living creatures were brought in. Step by step, the world was moving toward a moment that could no longer be delayed. And still, outside the ark, life continued as it always had. People lived, worked, and moved through their days, unaware or unwilling to see what was about to unfold. The presence of the ark stood before them, but its meaning remained unaccepted until the moment when preparation would end, and the event itself would begin. Because once the ark was ready, there would be nothing left to build, nothing left to prepare, nothing left to delay. Only one final step remained: to enter the ark and wait. And when that moment came, the world would change in a way that no one could ignore, no one could escape, and no one could reverse. The flood was no longer a warning. It was about to become reality. There is a moment in every story when everything changes, when preparation ends and reality begins. And in the account recorded in the book of Genesis, that moment arrives with a quiet finality that is almost easy to miss. The ark had been completed. Every instruction had been followed. The structure that had once seemed impossible now stood fully formed, filled with life, carrying within it the only hope for what would come next. Noah and his family had entered, along with the animals that had been brought inside, each according to its kind. The long years of preparation had led to this single point in time, a moment where there was nothing left to build, nothing left to gather, nothing left to prepare. And then the door was shut, not by Noah, but by God. It is a detail that carries immense weight, because it marks a boundary that cannot be crossed. What is inside is preserved. What remains outside is left to face. What is about to unfold? There is no further warning, no additional time, no second opportunity to respond. The period of waiting has ended. At first, the world outside may have seemed unchanged. The sky would have looked the same. The land would have felt the same beneath the feet of those who walked upon it. Life may have continued in its familiar rhythm, as if nothing were different. But then, something began to shift. Clouds gathered. The light of the sky dimmed, slowly at first, then more noticeably, as if the world itself were being covered. The air grew heavy. The stillness that often comes before a storm settled over the earth, creating a sense that something was about to happen, something that could not be stopped. And then the rain began. At first, it may have seemed ordinary, something that could be ignored or dismissed. But it did not stop. It did not pass. It did not fade into the background as a temporary change in weather. Instead, it continued, growing heavier, more relentless, more intense with each passing moment. What began as rain became a downpour. And what became a downpour turned into something far beyond anything the world had ever experienced. For 40 days and 40 nights, the rain fell without interruption. But the destruction did not come from above alone. The book of Genesis describes another source, something even more unsettling. The fountains of the great deep burst forth, releasing water from beneath the earth itself. It was as if the world was being overwhelmed from both directions at once, water descending from the sky and rising from below, converging in a force that could not be resisted. The ground that had once been stable began to disappear beneath rising waters. Rivers overflowed. Valleys filled. The landscape itself began to vanish as the flood spread outward, covering everything in its path. What had once been familiar became unrecognizable. What had once been secure was now unstable, and still, the water continued to rise. Higher and higher it climbed, reaching places that had never known water before. Hills disappeared. Mountains were swallowed beneath the surface. The boundaries that once defined the land were erased, replaced by an endless expanse that stretched in every direction. Everything outside the ark was overtaken. The scale of what was happening is almost impossible to fully comprehend. This was not a local disaster, not a regional flood that affected only part of the world. It was total absolute. There was no place untouched, no refuge outside the ark, no escape from what had been set into motion. Inside the ark, however, there was a different reality. Within its walls, there was protection. The structure that had been built over so many years now faced the very purpose for which it had been created. It rose with the waters, lifted by the force that was destroying everything else. While the world outside was being erased, the ark remained, carried above the chaos, sustained in the middle of it. And yet, even within that place of safety, the experience must have been overwhelming. The sound of the rain would have been constant, echoing against the structure without pause. The movement of the waters beneath them would have been felt in every shift, every rise and fall of the ark as it floated on the surface of a world that no longer existed in its previous form. Time itself would have seemed different, measured not by days of activity, but by the ongoing presence of something that showed no sign of ending. There was no view of land, no sign of what once was, no indication of how long it would last. Only water and waiting. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, as the floodwaters remained. The world outside had been completely transformed, its past erased beneath the surface. What had once been filled with life, movement, and human activity was now silent, covered, and still. And in that silence, one truth became undeniable. The world as it had been was gone. Everything that had defined it, everything that had filled it, everything that had made it what it was had been swept away. The decision that had once seemed distant, almost impossible to imagine, had now become reality in its fullest form. But the story does not end here, because within the ark, life remained. And as long as life remained, there was still a future. The flood had brought an end, but it had not erased everything. It had cleared the world, but it had also preserved something within it, a beginning that had yet to unfold. And as the waters continued to stretch across the earth, covering what once was, the next chapter of the story was already forming, hidden within the stillness, waiting for the moment when the waters would finally begin to fall. Because even after destruction, there would be a new beginning. For a long time, nothing changed. The waters that had covered the earth remained, stretching endlessly in every direction, erasing every boundary that had once defined the world. Inside the ark, time moved differently. There were no landmarks to measure progress, no visible signs to mark the passing of days. Only the steady motion of the waters beneath them and the quiet endurance of those within. Noah and his family could do nothing but wait, holding on to the belief that what had begun would one day come to an end. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to shift. The rain had already stopped, but now the waters themselves began to recede. It did not happen suddenly. There was no dramatic moment where the flood disappeared. Instead, it unfolded gradually, as if the world itself was taking a slow breath after a long and overwhelming silence. The vast surface that had once covered everything began to lower, revealing what had been hidden beneath. Somewhere beneath the ark, land was rising again. The book of Genesis tells us that the ark came to rest upon the mountains. It was a quiet moment, yet filled with meaning. After months of drifting without direction, the movement stopped. The ark, which had been carried by the waters, now stood still. It was the first sign that the world was beginning to take shape once again. But even then, the waiting was not over. Noah did not immediately step outside. The world beyond the ark was still uncertain, still in the process of becoming something new. The waters continued to recede, slowly revealing the land, restoring the boundaries that had once been erased. Time passed as Noah waited, watching, testing, seeking a sign that the earth was ready to be inhabited again. He sent out birds to search for dry ground, a small but significant act that reflected both patience and hope. The first attempts brought no clear answer. The world was not yet ready, but eventually the sign came: a return. A small indication that life could exist outside once more. It was not dramatic, not overwhelming, but it was enough. And then, at last, the moment arrived. God spoke to Noah again, instructing him to leave the ark. The door that had once closed, separating what was preserved from what was lost, was now opened. Noah stepped out onto the earth, followed by his family and the living creatures that had been kept safe within. What they saw was not the world they had known before. It was something entirely different. The past was gone. The structures, the places, the patterns of life that had once filled the earth had been erased. What remained was a world that had been washed clean. A world that carried no visible trace of what had come before. It was both empty and full of possibility, silent yet filled with the potential for life to begin again. In that moment, humanity stood at a new beginning. Noah's first action upon leaving the ark was not to build a home or claim land, but to acknowledge what had brought him through. He built an altar, offering something back to God, marking the moment not as an achievement of survival, but as an act of recognition. It was a quiet but powerful reminder that the story was not only about destruction or preservation, but about relationship, something that had once been lost and was now being restored. And then something remarkable followed. God made a promise, a covenant. It was not a promise that the world would never change or that humanity would never struggle again. But it was a commitment that what had just happened would not be repeated in the same way. The cycle of destruction that had once reset the world would not define its future. There would be seasons. There would be continuity. There would be a stability that allowed life to grow and continue across generations. As a sign of this promise, the rainbow appeared in the sky, a visible reminder that even after judgment, there could be mercy, and even after an ending, there could be a future. For Noah and those with him, the journey was not over. In many ways, it was just beginning. They were now responsible for rebuilding, for filling the earth once again, for shaping the course of humanity in a world that had been given a second chance. The story that had begun with creation, that had fallen into corruption, and that had been reset through the flood, now moved forward into something new. And yet, the questions raised by this story remain. What does it mean that a world could reach such a point of corruption that it had to be reset? What does it say about human nature, about the choices that shape not only individual lives but entire generations? And what can be learned from the fact that in the middle of that world, one man chose a different path? The story of Noah is not only about the past. It is a reflection, a mirror held up to every generation that follows. It speaks of consequences, of choices, of faith, and of the possibility that even in the darkest moments, there can still be a beginning waiting on the other side. Because in the end, the flood was not only an ending, it was also the start of everything that came after.